and welcome to KLC's Safety Moment. My name is Chris Hayes. I'm a loss control consultant for KLC, and we're glad to have you here today for the Safety Moment on Permit Required Confined Spaces. Today we'll have Captain Brandon Hayton here with the Pikeville Fire Department talking to you about Permit Required Confined Spaces. He's an expert in that and does training a lot, so we're really glad to have him here today to be able to talk on this subject. So I'm going to throw it here to Brandon.
Good morning, guys. In order to define what we're talking about with confined space rescue, we need to look at what a confined space actually is and the permitting requirements. Most of the material you're going to hear today has been sourced from two different standards. One is the ANSI Z117.1 2009 edition. The other is OSHA 29 CFR 1910 146. Both of those are going to be referenced throughout this material. But as a definition, a confined space is defined as something that's large enough and so configured that employees can enter that space and perform the work that's assigned to them. It is not designed for continuous employee occupancy within that space. As referenced before, OSHA Federal Register January 14, 1993, while OSHA is concerned with the spaces that are too small for complete bodily entry that may pose hazards to employees, the agency did not intend to cover such spaces under which the permitted space standard is referenced. You must have whole body entry, and you must be able to perform the work involved for it to be considered a confined space. A couple different hot button words come out in that. The first one is limited means of egress. Right? That is defined as anything that is restricted entry or exit in a physical configuration which requires the uses of hands for support or contortion of the body to enter into that space. When we say it's designed for continuous employee occupancy, it's large enough so that adults can work while standing. All right, you have to have lighting, and it does not require any additional considerations for safety and health. That's out of the preamble of OSHA 29 CFR 1910 146. In order to meet the definition for permit required confined space, it has to contain the potential for a hazardous atmosphere, contains a material that has potential for engulfing an entrant in flame, or has an internal configuration such that the entrant could be trapped or asphyxiated by internally converging walls or by a floor which slopes downward or tapers to a smaller cross section. It also has to contain any other recognized serious safety or health hazard. Of those special health and safety hazards we talk about, probably one of the most common ones we're going to deal with is hazardous atmospheres. Right, a hazardous atmosphere can be classified as a lot of things. Flammable gas, vapor, or mist that is greater than 10% of its LEL, or its lower explosive limit. Airborne dust greater than its lower flammable limit, or the 5 feet or less rule. Oxygen is also a consideration in these confined spaces, right? Much like any other time, we're looking for an oxygen concentration in the atmosphere of 19.5% to 23.5%. If you have less, it's oxygen deficient atmosphere. If you have more than 23.5, it's an oxygen enriched atmosphere. Both are dangerous and not permittable as confined spaces. Atmospheric concentration of anything that exceeds its permissible exposure limit, short-term exposure limit, or its ceiling limit will create a hazardous atmosphere also. When we're talking about hazardous atmospheres, one of the first things that has to take place with any confined space entry is atmospheric testing. It's important to remember your specific gravities and vapor densities you're going to deal with whatever particular chemical you have, and understanding the atmosphere stratify. Right, so, okay guys, this is the 4-gas monitor. This is not a sales pitch for any brand. This is just a particular one we have, and I would encourage you to be familiar with the one your particular agency or department has. I mentioned earlier the stratification and vapor density of different chemicals or different clouds or gases or mist, and with the appropriate manufactured supplied tubing, we'll take those atmospheric readings from depth. Right, we want to start from the bottom. We'll lower the tube in all the way to the bottom or as close as we can get, and in kind of 3 or 4 foot increments, we want to get those readings. The trick with these readings is we want to give the monitor time to react to the environment that it's in, and then establish our ventilation around it. So after 10 or 15 seconds we've had a reaction, we'll come up 3 or 4 feet, and we'll wait another 10 or 15 seconds, get another reading, and we'll come to the top or near 3 feet of the top of the hole. We'll obtain that reading, we'll report it to our entry supervisor, let our entrant see those, and then we'll be ready to make the entry on the permit. In reference to atmospheric testing and entry into a permitted confined space environment, the testing must take place inside the permitted space to determine if conditions are acceptable. Additionally, whoever that registered entrant is on the permit should see those values prior to making entry and not just take someone's word for it. If conditions worsen while that entrant is in that space, they should immediately cancel the permit and exit immediately. As previously mentioned, oxygen deficient, oxygen enriched atmospheres are considered hazardous atmospheres. If you have the presence of oxidation or any organics, also create the presence of a hazardous atmosphere, and anytime there's a engulfment and flame hazard, also substantiates a hazardous atmosphere condition. Some other special hazards in that space outside of atmosphere: inward converging sides. If you think of like a grain bin, it's a 10-foot square on top, it's a 2-foot square opening at the bottom. That in itself is a confined space. You can have electrical issues. All right, I'm far from an electrician. There's 3 things I know about it. It's convenient, it'll kill me, and I don't mess with it. I certainly don't want one in a confined space with me if there's an electrical hazard there. Any kind of corrosives, heat, thermal, or steam inside that atmosphere can be considered hazardous to us. And then wildlife in itself, right? We're in Kentucky. There's all manner of wildlife that can get into confined spaces, whether we're talking about vermin and varmints or snakes and large animals can get into confined space requirements. Requirements for evaluating a workplace, as far from an employer standpoint, are in place to determine if any space it meets the requirements to be a permit required confined space entry. That's in Appendix A of OSHA 29 CFR 1910-146. And there's also a flow chart there to assist. I know we're talking about a lot of stuff real quick. There's always flow charts. We don't expect you to remember all this stuff. This is merely to provide you guidance and give you some resources where you can go find that stuff. All right. For an employer also, besides evaluating the requirements for that confined space entry, it is also the obligation of the employer to prevent unauthorized entry, right? And that's through proper signage. It starts simple, right? We've got to have signage to dictate to all the other employees on the job site where those confined spaces may exist. It is also the obligation of employers to provide information and training. It's not one of these things that we have confined spaces that exist and we just want to hold on to that information and not spread it around. We also want to make sure all of our employees are competent to be around those type spaces if an emergency were to exist. If the employees don't have to enter a permit required confined space, then the employer should always prevent the entry. If the employee does have to enter that space, the employer has to develop and implement a permit required confined space entry program. All right, guys, so in line with that permit required confined space entry program, some of those program requirements that are multifaceted, right, is the program has to have requirements that prevent unauthorized entry. There's a laundry list of reason for fatalities in confined spaces of employees, and a lot of them are human error. So our program has to be geared around requirements that prevent unauthorized entry and only guaranteeing that qualified people are the ones entering those spaces. Another requirement is it has to determine the hazard prior to entry. We have to know what's in that space before we make entry into that space and go into the unknown. Also, our program needs to be developed and implemented a means and procedures and practices necessary for safe permit entry into that operation. With our program requirements also, we need to designate people who have active roles and assign responsibilities to each role. And the 3 minimum roles that we have are entrant, attendant, and entry supervisor. And each one of those has its own set of qualifications and responsibilities when we get onto that scene. Your program also has to develop and implement a procedure for calling rescue services, whether that be in-house in your own fire brigade or rescue company, or 911, and how do we get those assets into that scene if we're in the need of immediate rescue. Our program also must develop a system for issuing and canceling permits. We're going to talk extensively about permits in just a moment, but there are certain regulations and rules that go with permits, and our program has to describe and lay out what those regulations and rules are for our permits that we're going to use ourselves. You also have to have the ability to coordinate with outside contractors, right? People that don't necessarily work for the company you work for, but they're there doing a job, and if that is the case and they're on that property, then they fall under the same permit required confined space entry program that we conduct ourselves. We have to create a means for reevaluating if problems or issues occur during that operation. It's not one of these things where we can make an entry into a confined space, something go wrong, and we just throw up our hands. We have to have a plan in place ahead of time to address those issues as they may arise. With evaluation of those issues, and maybe a means to an end to some of those issues, is there certain required equipment that are required with your program, right? And simple stuff could be 4 gas monitors, ventilation equipment, communication equipment with PPE, lighting, barriers, ladders, and then rescue equipment if that's something you do on yourself. And those are just a minimum list to kind of give you some guidance on what your program requirements might be. All right, guys, now more specifically about those permits that we talked about in our permit required confined space program. Again, I'm not expecting you guys to remember everything. We're not trying to reinvent the wheel. There are plenty of samples that can be found out there, especially if you go to the Appendix D of OSHA 29 CFR 1910-146. There are 2 examples of how those permits should look. Speaking to the rules and regulations, whoever that entry supervisor is, one of their responsibilities is they must sign that permit prior to entry. If you were to be safety checked, or your safety officer comes around, or OSHA comes to your scene, they're going to want to see that signed entry permit on location where that entry is taking place, and it must always be available. It can't be something that you left it in your office, you left it in your truck. It has to be where that entry is taking place. The permit cannot exceed the listed time, or the entry cannot exceed the listed time on the permit. If you put an hour work time on that permit, then you are limited to an hour. After that, we have to do another permit. Termination of the permit can be conducted by the entry supervisor once that time has passed, or if an incident occurs either inside or outside of that permit required space. Additionally, a responsibility of the employer is those permits must be retained for a 12 calendar month period after that work is done. That if OSHA or your safety person comes to you and asks to see your entry permits for the last year, you have to have those ready and available in one place together. And a lot of this stuff is going to be addressed when it comes to training. Right? I know that's everybody's favorite thing is training, but when you're going into an unknown space, you have to have it. Training must be conducted prior to you having your first responsibilities of your job assigned to you. If you have a change in duties, it's always a good idea to have redundant training for that next level of duties that you're about to incur. Right? If you have a change in operation, we go from a normal work entry permit to a rescue situation. We've had a change in operation. We have to train for that ahead of time. That way we have a flow of how that works and how to integrate the other part of that into our system out of our program. If the employer feels like the employees are deviating from the established program, it's always a good time to have refresher training. It may be out of malice, it may be intentional, it may be completely unintentional and they just don't understand the program. It's always a good idea to refresh on that training. With training also, we want to document all training that's taking place with the signatures of both the trainees and the instructors. And then there's also your records retention requirements for that training documentation also, depending on what side of the coin you're on, whether the work side or the rescue side. Each one of us are going to have our own record retention requirements for documentation of training.
Thank you, Captain Hayton. That does it for this KLC Safety Moment. Thanks for watching and stay safe.